Welcome from All Rays. We're really excited about our second LP series event today. I am Marian Arake and I run digital events here at All Rays. And as some of you may know, we are a nonprofit dedicated to amplifying female voices, accelerating female success, and creating a tech culture where women are leading, shaping, and funding the future, not only on the founder side, but as well as the funder side. And our events are key to building and amplifying our movement, which will rewire tech and venture capital industries. So again, thank you to our volunteers and partners who help us make this possible, and to all of you and Jess who will be running our event today. So before we get started, just a few things to keep in mind. Again, please use the chat box to introduce yourselves. It's always nice to see who's in the room. And as you have questions for Jess, once we start the session, please feel free to put all of your questions in the Q&A box. That will be easiest for us to kind of trickle through that. And this webinar will be recorded today and will be accessible within the next few days after. So definitely keep an eye on our website. And yes, without further ado, I'll share a little bit more about Jess. So Jess is a Chief Operating Officer at Aduro Advisors. She joined Aduro as a controller in 2014 and transitioned into the operations team in 2016. Previously, she was a senior program manager at Euphoria Studios, a fitness startup where she helped launch the company's flagship. She did begin her career as an auditor at PricewaterhouseCoopers in San Jose, where she focused on top-tier domestic and international venture capital funds. From there, she transitioned into the industry as a senior accountant and accounting manager at Legacy Venture, a philanthropic funds of funds where she gained a unique perspective of a limited partner. She earned her BA in economics with a focus on accounting from the University of California, Santa Cruz. So we are so excited to have Jess join us today. And before we get started, we're going to do a quick poll. Again, we always love to see who's in the room, and it will also help us kind of see how we cater the session for you today. So launching a poll right now. And basically, we want to know who's in the room with us today. Are you an aspiring fund manager? I'm raising my first fund, or I'm raising my second fund. And we'll give you about 10 more seconds. I see the votes coming in. So thank you for all of those who are taking the poll. And we're going to close it out in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, and we're sharing results. So about 54% of the room is an aspiring fund manager, 20% has raised their first fund, and 27% is raising their second. So great to see. Thank you for everyone. That's very helpful to know, and I'm sure for Jess as well. And yeah, welcome again. And Jess, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Marian. It's really great to be here. We're very excited to partner with All Rays to bring, shed some light on the fund administration space, as well as best practices in the industry. I know that, for a lot of first-time fund managers or investors who have not had a ton of experience on the fund administration and administrative side, a lot of this can feel super daunting. So I just want to give an overview today and highlight some of the sort of key best practices to, set you up for success. So let's see, we talked a little bit about my background. Thanks so much, Marian, for that great introduction. I just want to tell you a little bit about our firm because I think that's probably helpful context for everyone here. So I'm the COO at Aduro Advisors. We are headquartered in Denver, but we are really sort of a remote company in part. And so we are geographically distributed across the country as well. We're really a tech-enabled premier fund administrator. So that means that we use technology, both proprietary and additional pieces of software in our software stack to execute on sort of high touch, high service fund administration. And we'll talk about what fund administration kind of encompasses because sometimes that's not always super clear. So we'll dive into that next. We really bring a team of industry veterans, deep industry experience across the board at our senior level, as well as controller level and beyond. We support about 260 firms and around 27 billion in administration that we provide services for. We have around 100 team members on the client side. And then about me personally, I'm located in San Francisco and I'm a French bulldog and cheeseburger enthusiast. So something to kind of always keep my eye out for is great French bulldogs that I get to go pet and cheeseburgers to try around the city. So, all right, so hopping into it. So given the questions that were submitted, and thank you so much to everyone who submitted a question, I'm going to stay pretty big picture today, but I'm always happy to talk offline about specific questions or maybe a little bit more technical questions around fund administration. I'm trying to do like a little bit of a mix of everything so that we cover all the questions that were submitted for the most part. But before we get into some of like the more strategic pieces of building a back office, I really wanted to level set on what fund administration is, because I think there is somewhat of a misunderstanding. And if you haven't had experience with it, that totally makes sense, right? A lot of those who are raising their first fund or considering raising their first fund have been on the investing side, right? And that's what you're really good at, and that's what you have experience in. The fund administration piece is new, but it is a key component to running a successful firm, right? So definitely want to walk through this. So fund administration, what does this entail? So when you engage a fund administrator, or if you even hire a team in-house to perform fund administration duties, this is what we're really talking about. So fund operations, this can sometimes fall into sort of like investor relations or investor communications. I kind of think of those as separate functions, because capital calls, distributions, and some quarterly reporting, they also have sort of more strategic components or operational components, like how much capital do I call? When do I call capital? What does my capital call notice look like? How much information do I include? Do I not include, right? What does my distribution look like? How much do I distribute? Those are kind of fund operations items, or at least I consider them to be fund operations items. Then we have like sort of the bread and butter, like every fund administrator and every in-house team is going to do accounting and reporting, right? So accounts payable, making sure your invoices get paid, the day-to-day bookkeeping of the cash coming in and out of the fund, as well as preparing the quarterly financial statements and the LP capital accounts, right? And then investor relations. So there's more to it than this, but investor relations is really like contact updates. Those happen quite a bit. Transfers of interest, making sure those are appropriately reflected on your books, and ad hoc LP requests like audit confirmations. In-house teams may have questions around how much capital have you called, distributions, how to treat distributions for tax purposes, things like that. So this is definitely part of it. And then kind of on a more annual basis, you're thinking audit and tax, right? So your fund admin team should be giving you insight on and advice to ensure that all the transactions that you're doing during the year, so valuations, realized gain loss, those sorts of things, are in line with your limited partnership agreement, but also that they're in line with US GAAP. Okay, so you really want to ensure that you're able to have consistency throughout the year, and that anything that you prepare won't get adjusted on an annual basis when you come through a financial statement audit. Your fund administration kind of team or your in-house team should be responsible for being the main point of contact for audit and tax. Your team should prepare the audited financial statements and notes, and review tax returns, send out all the K1s, and do like tax planning, sort of like big picture, providing information to your tax team on a day-to-day basis. There's also kind of big picture components of fund administration as well. So thinking through like performance metrics, those are obviously key to understand how the fund is performing, as well as when you get into the fundraising time, it's obviously very important to have those ready for your LP meetings. General fund operations, as I said before, it's not just let's call capital, right? It's when should I call capital? When will I need to call capital next? What's my overall cadence? What's sort of like my thoughts and methodology around that? And then thinking through sort of recycling, reserve analysis, that kind of stuff is also more advisory service that is important to the health and sort of maintenance of a fund over the long haul. Your team should also be able to provide sort of bespoke solutions. So what I mean by that is I think a strong team will be able to say, okay, these are my LPs, these are my investments. Like when problems come up, providing solutions specifically for your set of circumstances is really key in having a strong team that's able to support you in this function. One thing I wanted to also highlight on is fund admin should also include services for the GP and management company entities. And so that oftentimes isn't always super clear just from administration services or a fund administrator. Your GP entity and your management company entity are separate entities that should have separate books and records from day one. These are obviously important. If you are the primary GP or the primary member of these entities, those transactions will flow through to you personally. And so it's important that those are, adequately and appropriately accounted for, and that then, you go through the tax process and that flows through to you. So definitely something to highlight here that that should be sort of taken into account when you're thinking about fund administration and a back office function. Okay. So a lot of people ask, like, what should I be looking for? Like, when I'm looking for at fund administrators, or if I'm looking at an in-house team, like, what am I looking for? So from my personal standpoint, I think you're looking for something that's tech enabled, and then you want an experienced and responsive team. So what does that mean? Tech enabled means that your team is efficient and you have more tools at your disposal, and hopefully a smaller team can go further because they're using technology to streamline the capital call process, the distribution process, the accounting process. The systems are synced so that they work together, and it's a very clear and concise workflow for a small team. And then when you think about experienced and responsive team, what does that mean, right? Well, for me, experience means experienced, obviously, in the industry. Why does that matter? Well, this stuff is really specific to alternative investments, alternative assets. And there are kind of nuances and best practices in the industry that, are really, that knowledge is housed in people who have experience and have done it before, right? So, or learn from others that have done it before. So really having an experienced team, it doesn't need to be every single person on your team that you work with that's super experienced, but having really someone who can give you that guidance and steer you in the right direction. Obviously you need to legally follow your LPA, and having someone who can help interpret that for you, and that you can rely on is really important. And then responsive is pretty obvious, but your business is going to move quickly. Funds move really, really quickly. So being able to communicate with your team easily and making sure that you can get to them before you're making decisions is really important to be able to get to the right outcomes.
Jess,
Yeah.
so sorry. One
No,
question to the tech piece. Can you share names of tools you've used for fund administration?
Sure. So Aduro itself has a proprietary piece of software called Fund Panel. We actually allow third parties to use it as well, but that allows us to send out all of our LP communications. It stores all of our contacts and really streamlines that process and integrates with the rest of our accounting software. For smaller teams, and I really do recommend using something like a Xero or a QuickBooks for the day-to-day accounting. It typically is robust enough for the majority of the accounting that you would need. And then looking to an expense solution is typically a really great thing to bring on very early. So something like a tally or an expensify that will help organize your receipts. And if you have a team that's using like multiple credit cards, that all can get really, really, really messy and cumbersome quickly, right? If you use software that's very easy to kind of streamline that process. I would also just say in general, like making sure that you understand like your workflow internally as well. How, like, okay, we have expenses, we have expense reports due around this time every month, right? So that we're not going multiple months. Like, it's easy to say expense reporting, who cares, right? But when you do it monthly, it's much easier than doing it all at once 6 months later when you don't remember any of it, right? And that's a key component to making sure things are tagged correctly, that they're going to the right entity, that you're, in compliance with your LPA, and that people are getting reimbursed, and you have records for the IRS should you need them. So it's those things that they seem really simple, but I think those are great kind of pieces to get started with. We use Gusto for payroll. It's really, I think you should be looking for a fund administrator or a back office team to give you sort of proposed tech stack solutions too. That to me is an expectation I would have when chatting with a fund administrator. Like, how are you going to make this as streamlined as possible, not only for me, the GP, but for yourself. So I know you're efficient and that you're not, manually doing all these things. Okay, hopefully that got to it. I think one thing that is a bit of a misconception for new fund managers or fund managers in general is that there are still responsibilities that are GP responsibilities with regards to fund administration. So, obviously, ultimate decision and final review of, the financial statements before they go out, or, things that are put together like the capital call, signing off on calling 5% versus 7%, or determining what percentage really makes sense, right? That will be in collaboration with your team, but at the end of the day, that's really, based upon some knowledge that only the general partner has oftentimes. Valuations and valuation methodology. So it's very rare for fund administrators to do valuations because of the fact that, again, the GP has the best knowledge of the company and how it's performing and if it's meeting expectations or not. A fund administrator should, though, help walk you through determining a valuation policy or valuation methodology that you're consistent with, and then support you in helping you understand what information you need to put together for evaluation to be in line with US GAAP and to really be, consistent quarter over quarter. Budgeting is something that typically falls in-house as well. And so that's really, how am I going to budget inside my fund? So what expenses am I going to have? What providers am I going to use and bill to the fund as allowable by your partnership agreement? But also, your management company, how are you going to spend your money? Which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But that is a key component. We don't know as a fund administrator necessarily, like, do you want to have an office? Do you not want to have an office? What is the most important person that you should be hiring and how much should they be paid, right? Those are things that we can help give you guidelines, but a lot of times the final sort of like check the box, this is ready to go, is really on the GP. And then obviously maintaining LP relationships, maintaining portfolio company relationships, and really investment composition strategy within the fund also falls typically to the GP. Okay. So you're probably thinking like, there are a million possibilities. How do I know what's right for me? And that's actually like what I love about the industry, is that there are a million possibilities. And as long as they're in line with your limited partnership agreement, there are typically multiple ways to do something. I think it's good news and bad news, right? It allows you to do things in line with your vision for the firm and achieve, specific goals. It's tough because I think there's lots of times when we're all say like, hey, can you just tell me the 20 things I need to do exactly? And it's not always that simple. So where do you start when you kind of are thinking about your firm and thinking about how to make some of these decisions? And to give you a little bit of context, so when I was a controller, there was a time that I was responsible for our onboarding team, which is really how we bring all of our new clients and onto Aduro's platform. And so I worked a lot with first-time, general partners. I still continue to do so, but a lot more closely at that point in time. And a lot of times they talked about like, how do I do this? How do I know how much capital call? What should I do next, right? And I always think that it comes down to sort of like, what's your vision for your firm and what are the things that are key about you? So I always ask our partners to say, okay, like, what am I good at? Like when they're like, who should I be hiring? Okay, what are you good at? What do you have experience with? What do you like spending your time on? What would be something that you wouldn't want to spend your time on or absolutely hate or would procrastinate forever to not have to work on it, right? What are you not as strong at? And then what do you want your brand as a general partner to be? What do you want to be known for? What do you want your firm to be known for? And then who are my LPs? What are their expectations? And like really you can take this even further, right? Like thinking about how you want to interact with your founders, how you want to interact in the overall marketplace as a syndicate. Like there's multiple ways to kind of take this, but I think it does, if you have this sort of guiding vision for yourself and for your firm, helps answer a lot of the questions that come up on a day-to-day basis. So what are some of those things? Selecting service providers. Like you could think, where do I even start, right? One, I would also say, like always say, pull your network for recommendations, right? But similar to the last slide, probe into why they recommend someone, right? Is it for something that you don't care about at all that adds no value because you are going to do it yourself anyways? Or is it something or is a negative comment something that you actually love and would love to have that type of relationship? I think really understanding, why someone's recommending or what you're looking for, what would be a great compliment to you as an investor as you run your firm, is really important. Selecting service providers, what kind of service providers could you have? The primary ones that you see fairly often are legal, fund administration, audit, tax, operations, and HR. So legal is obviously extremely important. And what should you be looking for? Someone who really understands the best practices in the industry norms, right? You're going to have LPs who invest in a lot of different entities. You want to also have a team that understands the options that you have if you have certain things that you're trying to achieve, right? Fund administration, we kind of talked through, but again, I think a tech-enabled team, I think they should have a vision and an opinion on technology, and be technology positive. And then again, experience, they've done this before, they have a track record, and depending upon what you think your needs are, right? How much client service do you want? Do you not want? Do you want someone to be able to walk you through stuff? Would you rather just not talk to your team? There are different ways, and I think a great provider on any of these areas is going to be able to kind of roll with that a little bit, right? Audit, you really want to look for someone who has a reputation and industry experience. And I think thinking about what makes sense for my size of firm, right? If your fund is on the smaller side, you're not going to want something that's, necessarily big four. Does that make sense for your LP base? Does it make sense for your size of your fund? Is it too cost prohibitive, right? Asking those questions. I would still strongly advise you to look for a regional firm that's extremely reputable and has other VC or alternative asset clients though. And then tax. Tax is something that is so important. I think, thinking through reputation, industry experience again, who has done this before, who has a broad variety of venture capital or private equity type clients or similar to what you do. And then, thoughtful solutions. They will have experience having seen many things. It will be like, oh, when you have this exit that you're trying to figure out, they have recommendations for. They can also get really strategic around like, okay, like advising you on QSBS and other opportunity zones, like things like that, where a really strong tax provider is going to be proactive about those things and come to you and say, hey, have you considered this? Thinking about operations in HR. So, this is something that we see more infrequently as an outsourced provider. A lot of times teams will bring an operational person in-house, although there are firms that do operations in HR. And I think if you're on the smaller side, it makes a ton of sense to use them for projects that you need. I would, again, encourage you to look for someone who has a lot of industry experience, right? Someone who understands sort of the cultural norms within the industry as well. To a certain extent, like how does an annual meeting work normally, right? Because we want things to be somewhat in line, although we can get creative when presenting our brand and the things that make us unique and special. So definitely, an option to bring on as well. There were some questions around like, where do I spend my money if I only have X number of dollars? Legal is so important. It governs all the, pieces of your firm and your fund, like how you're going to execute on them. So I would say legal is really important. Tax is really important because a lot of those things obviously have compliance issues related to them. And then I would say, audit and fund admin are also key to having a great foundation for your firm. Um, Figuring out again how much it would make sense to budget expense wise for the size of your fund can be a really good starting place to know, what makes sense on a recurring basis, because, there will be some legal expense on a recurring basis, but fund admin, audit and tax will always be every year until the fund winds down. So it's something to just keep in mind. And then great service providers should work together. So, at Aduro, when we are helping with a distribution, will involve potentially legal if it's something that's really complicated. Will involve potentially audit to make sure that we're doing it correctly if there's something weird, right? And then tax to make sure we understand the tax implications and everyone's on the same page. So, your team should proactively reach out to one another to make sure that things work smoothly and that you're not the person that's kind of like banding everyone together, right? Same thing like audit, your fund administrator should be talking to your auditor multiple times a year, checking in when things come up that are maybe out of the norm, or if they have questions about best practice in the industry, or what the auditor is seeing, or, new pronouncements that are coming out. So those are all things that we would anticipate that, your service provider should kind of do proactively for you. Okay. There were a lot of questions on building our back office team, and this is one that we get a lot of questions about as well, from our client base. It's really, I wish there was like just a really simple answer, like you always hire this first. But again, it's really going to be specific to you, to your team, to your strengths, to the things that you want to spend time on. So I always think that the goal for our investing partners should be to me making investments and working with LPs and working with their founders as much as possible, right? And so anything you can do to bring someone in house that takes anything that doesn't relate to those things off your plate to a certain extent is really smart, right? But there's things to consider, right? What's my budget? So your back office team, if you bring in people in-house, that's typically in most limited partnership agreements and management, like company agreements, operating agreements, going to be an expense that's paid for out of your management fee. So understanding your budget, what can you actually afford to bring in-house, which kind of leads to the second question, outsource or in-house. So kind of going back to the last slide, typically audit, tax, and fund administration, as well as most legal, related to the fund are going to be fund expenses. So that would be paid for out of the fund versus your management fee, right? So thinking about that as well, like, does it make sense to bring it in-house? Do I have room in my fund? Do I have room in my management fee? And those are all questions to kind of ask. And like, how much will you really be using these resources? I think a lot of times it can be like, oh, I just need a person. But then it's like, actually, you need 50% of a CFO and 25% of, an admin or something like that, right? And then it's like, oof, I don't actually know that I need a full-time person in-house yet. So really asking that question and then trying to, ask around about too, like what are other people your size doing and what have they, found to be useful? Who's my first hire? So kind of based on everything else I said, like kind of in line with that, it's like, it depends on what you need and it depends on your firm strategy, right? If you have a strategy of bringing a lot to your founders and you're going to do these 22 things every single investment you make, then maybe it's someone who is more founder and portfolio company focused, right? Is it that you're actually really administratively challenged and you are not great at organizing things? You need someone to help you with your calendar. You travel quite a bit, before the pandemic, those kinds of things. And maybe it's an assistant hire, or maybe it's that you just really don't want to be in the loop on fund administration as much. That could be more of an operational hire or a CFO finance kind of hire, right? And it's really going to depend on kind of, again, what your strengths and what your strategy is for your firm. As a fund administrators, we really enjoy working with having a resource in-house, whether it's an operations person or a finance person. It can be really helpful and take a lot off the GP's plate. And so, that can be a really great place to start. But again, it depends on where you're spending your time and really what your pain points are internally. Um, so, which really determines who your first hire is going to be. And then when to hire. This one's also pretty tricky, right? I think a lot about budget. Like, where are you at in your management fee cycle? Where are you at in your fundraising cycle? Where are your pain points, right? It's going to be really a place where, okay, I have these pain points. It's going to take 3 to 6 months to get someone up to speed. So I think that's a thing to also really consider before it's like, at a breaking point. And then what are my management fees available? Who can I afford? When can I afford them? A lot of times it is like, fund one, you may not be able to afford to have someone in-house, depending on your fund size. But with fund two coming online and there just being, additional fee as well as additional just work to do, it can make a lot of sense then. It just really depends on your specific firm and the size of your firm and again, what is really painful to you specifically. And then building a team from fund one to fund two, I kind of touched on this already, but we really do encourage our teams to bring people in-house to support them because, as a GP, you should be spending your time investing. And so thinking about where you want to scale, what makes the most sense, and then talking to funds that have scaled that have similar strategies to you and are similar size, right? That's really the key thing. Like, we have lots of firms that we work with on fund two, they already had 8 people, right? But their firm had a specific strategy and they were of a specific size, right? That's not going to make sense for someone who has a smaller fund who has been sort of a sole GP. Bringing on 4 people would actually be extremely chaotic, right? And may not be the best way to run your firm or the best use of your management fees. So all things to really consider and work with your fund administrator to talk through, their perspective and talk through it with other people that in the industry, your peers. Okay. There were a lot of questions on LP communications. And we do have this come up quite a bit. So in my perspective and experience, being on, the LP side, when I was at a fund of funds, I think LPs really value transparency in what's going on and consistency. So really knowing what to expect, having consistent product and quality product every time, and then having consistent valuation methodology, for example, that we know that we're using across the board for like situations. So I would say those would be some guiding principles when thinking about your LP communications. It's really dependent upon your LP base, right? If you are on the smaller side and have more individuals or high net worth individuals, it may be different than if you have a significant number of institutionals, right? The amount of information that you provide, the level of detail that you provide may just be different. And so that can happen a lot of times from fund one to fund two. Maybe it's that, we see a lot of times people join our platform for fund two because they have more institutionals and it makes sense to have a little bit more support and heavy lifting on some of these communications and overall process in-house, so or in back office. So talking through, you're going to have standard operational touch points, and so you can use those however you like, right? Capital calls, distributions, quarterly reporting, annual reporting, and K1 distribution are all things that need to happen as required by your limited partnership agreement, and they're just normal operational things. The level of information that you provide is really up to you and sort of your vision for how you interact with your limited partners. Other modes of communication that you have with those limited partners. So, you're going to have potentially one-on-one check-ins, thinking through how you want to do those, right? You may have an LP advisory committee created. How do you want to structure those meetings? What do you want to cover? What things do you want to raise to that committee? How often are you checking in? One thing I didn't write here, but is another kind of classic historical thing that people have done in the industry is your annual meeting. Do you want to have an annual meeting? At what point do you have an annual meeting? Some of my old firms had in-person, very robust annual meeting presentations on obviously an annual basis, but sometimes they would have additional calls that were, in between time as well. And then thinking about how you want to have these touch points feel, right? Most firms are just doing standard operational touch points. So they're just sending out a cap call notice. There's not really a lot of information, but distributions, you may provide some color as to what happened, right? What is this related to? Because those are huge wins that you want to celebrate and explain to people. And again, quarterly letters are something that are oftentimes used as a touch point for people to talk through. So I wanted to talk through this. We get a lot of questions on like, what do I put in my quarterly letter? So they're typically not required, although honestly, I have seen, and you need to check your agreement if they are required. There's some that say every 6 months you need to send a quarterly letter that gives this kind of information. So it is not necessarily required, but there are some agreements that do have it. But it's pretty standard. Most firms are writing them, but you know what? You don't need to write one if they're not required by your agreement, right? That can be your sort of like, again, your brand, your signature, your vision for how you're interacting. It's up to you. They should be written by the GP, and there's always questions about like, how long should it be? What should I include? I think you want to be transparent. Like we said, LPs appreciate transparency, but I think there's also a level of information. So, we don't know, it's a document that can be forwarded, right? So being thoughtful of like what your founders would feel like, or what information you include in there as well, because again, we don't know once the PDF goes out, right? We hope, but we do not know what happens with it. And so we don't want to be like sharing proprietary and private information there. Length, we've seen anywhere from just like a little paragraph blurb to 30, 40, 50 pages on every portfolio company, their statistics, and update on what they're doing. I typically give the guidance that we want to give just like a high level update, a couple of pages of what's happening in the industry or sector in which I invest, right? What's the update that I'm seeing, the trends that I'm seeing there? What's going on with my portfolio companies, if there's anything like new financings to note, or maybe there's a write-off or something that you want to explain in greater detail, right? And then what's going on with your firm? You hired someone, or you plan to fundraise soon, or you've moved locations, or you've invested in this piece of technology you're super excited about, right? Really trying to explain, it's an opportunity to say like to your LPs, this is why you invested in me, right? This is what I bring to the table. This is my point of view. This is what I'm thinking, right? So these are all areas to kind of share. And then you can go into more detail in phone calls or one-on-ones if there's maybe more proprietary information you want to share that's not meant to be in print and then emailed out, right? So that's kind of the high level recommendation. I do understand that there's lots of firms that want to do a like page by page on the portfolio companies. They do take a lot of time. So I think just doing a cost benefit analysis of like, how much time does this take you away from spending time with your portfolio companies, and what information is actually, you can ask your LPs, what information is interesting and important to you to receive updates on, right? That's fairly simple and would probably make it more efficient for you. So it's all about, being thoughtful with your time. All right. So making it to kind of general recommendations. So high level, invest in team members and service providers that you trust. You want to feel good about who you work with. You're going to have in the beginning probably a fairly small team, right? And so if that's the case, like you want to be excited about who you're working with and feel like they've got your back, especially when there are areas that are new to you, like maybe how to do some administrative pieces of your fund. Leverage your providers and be engaged, or hire someone, right? I think leveraging your providers, making sure you're asking the right questions, making sure that they're talking to one another and they're all connected. But also like being engaged and asking if you don't understand what something means, or, really coming to the table when, someone has a question like, how do you want it to go? Being engaged in that process as well. Or hiring someone who can do that on your behalf and that you can trust to say, okay, we should be calling capital 4 times a year or 6 times a year, or we should be using a line of credit, all of those types of things that maybe are not something that you really feel excited about spending your time on, but are super important and strategic to you running your firm. Limited partnership provisions. I think it's important to understand your LPA high level. It's not necessarily that you need to be like in the nitty gritty, understanding every last, definition or things like that necessarily. But, what are your limitations on making investments? What are your concentration limits? What are, when can you raise your next fund? Like, these are all things that are inside of your LPA and are important to you running a firm that's compliant with your, the legal document that governs it. But also, those are obviously meant to protect you, protect your limited partners, and it's important that you're compliant with it. And having an understanding of that will help you on a day-to-day basis. Again, does not need to be super in depth, but I think, knowing that you can't make a 25% investment with, 25% of your commitments investment is important. I think understanding fund operations high level, just understanding the cadence and working with your either back office team or fund administrator to really understand, like, okay, what do I have coming up this quarter? It's like quarterly reporting is quarters 1 through 3. We're at an audit. What are my responsibilities? Do I need to write a memo? Do I need to work with auditors? How much time is that going to take? And being engaged in that process, right? Because these are your companies and your investments, and you want to make sure you feel great about the valuations that they end up at. And then again, building a team that's based on you. So strategy, what is your firm strategy? What does that look like? How are you going out to market? What's special about you and your fund and your firm? And build a team based on that, right? How do you want to interact with your LPs and other, funds and your portfolio companies, and building a team that can execute on that. And really playing to your strengths and weaknesses and making sure that you are really teed up to be able to fly and kind of focus on those, the next big company. So kind of in conclusion, so there's really no one size fits all approach, right? Your approach is going to depend on your vision, your team, your strategy, your fund size, your LP composition, and the things that are really important to you personally and that you feel super passionate about. And so our recommendation is, one, that you work with, again, someone who can help you figure out these things, and have providers that can kind of support you through that process. But then also that you're building for flexibility, and really the long haul when you're able to, right? So you may not always have the budget today, but how do you think about building a sustainable firm, but also with team members or pieces of software that are flexible to grow with you, so that you're not, migrating from one database to another database with Fund 2 because the first one didn't work out that great, or, and I think a lot of that you can receive guidance on that from peers, again, who've done it already and what they're using, but also, again, service providers who can kind of help guide you to some of the things that can set you up foundationally for long-term success. Okay, so that's all that I put together. There were a lot of questions that didn't fall specifically into these areas, and so I did want to touch on those a little bit. We already covered sort of like the best tech stack or software solutions. When people are talking about like, how can I bootstrap and like, what can I do to do it myself a little bit? QuickBooks and Xero, if you have, some accounting like experience, or you can start running some of your expenses or credit cards through there. It's fairly straightforward to a certain extent. So those are some of the like low cost tools that you could use to kind of start doing some of this stuff yourself, as well as like an Expensify for your expenses. Bootstrapping is tough. I would recommend not doing it on the legal side, if possible, or using the best legal firm that you can afford, because of the fact that there are some, you want your waterfall to flow, right? You want everything to be in line with industry best practice and standard on the legal side, especially. But, same thing there's a lot of implications again on the tax and accounting side as well. So it gets a little bit tough when we talk about those specific things. And the things that you can bootstrap, again, kind of are specific to you, right? Like this is what you can do well or not do well. And then someone asked what the most important piece of back office like should be in line for everything else to fall in place. I think what happens a lot of times for firms where there's like you really can kind of hit the ground running and everyone can kind of do their own thing and live up to their full potential is really switching from being reactive to proactive. You know, fire drills are not good for anyone. Like it doesn't matter who you are. They're hard to execute on time and time again. And so switching from being reactive to being a little bit more on the proactive side, like planning ahead and trying to get visibility into the pipeline to the extent that you can, or developing a process to get more transparency and clarity earlier in the process. Communicating with your team, like how much cash do I have on a consistent basis, right? So you know, okay, I need $4 million in 2 weeks. We better call capital because I have 50 grand of just like expense reserves right now, right? So really having those conversations with your team, whether it be your fund administrator, whether it be your in-house team, of like what you see coming down the pike and doing that consistently, even when you're like, this is a waste of time, right? I do think there's times where you can make that meeting shorter, but like even just having that touch point and having that sort of like routine is really key in getting into sort of good hygiene for the long haul. And then using systems so that, or using systems, like letting systems help you become better internal communicators, right? Maybe it's that you're all working in different locations or you're not in the office as much together. What systems can you use to streamline your workflow, or so that you can log on and say, oh, this opportunity is in this stage, or we finished our internal diligence, we just have references to do, or whatever it may be, right? Like really having transparency and communication in your team so that they can just kind of hit the ground running versus being like, what's next? What do I do now, right? What do we need next? I think that is really, really key. Someone asked about due diligence questionnaires and ad hoc requests from LPs. How can I streamline that process? Ad hoc requests from LPs is tricky. What we do at Aduro is that we have an LP facing portal, and I do recommend that any outsourced fund admin provider that you use has one because it does help streamline the K1 process. We also post quarterly reporting on there, and every LP can log on and see like call history and things like that, distribution history, capital account balance history. I can recall like when I was in house as an accountant, right? I would log on to, the portals of our investments and say, okay, like does my cap calls that I think I've paid in tie to what they think I've paid in, right? And then if there wasn't a portal, that's the time where I'm like, I'm sorry, like I just need to check how many, like if paid in capital ties, right? And so that can eliminate some of those questions where you can direct them to your LP portal. And then due diligence questionnaires are tough, right? Because there are many institutional LPs who have a set 20 things that they need answered, right? But can you create something internally that shows what you can proactively share that says like, hey, here's our process for cash. Like, Aduro sets up the wire and I approve, and Aduro can't approve. So like cash is pretty secure, or whatever it is. And if you can put that into a document and share that proactively, sometimes that might sort of check the box, right? It may not, but it may be a good start for conversations as well. And it shows that you're thinking about it and you're thinking about making your LPs' lives easier as well. So I think it's like all a win. We internally have our own sort of standard DDQ. And I would encourage you, I think that makes sense for others to think about putting something together that summarizes their processes. Okay.
Jess, we have a couple of questions from the audience. One is, is Fund Panel suitable for single investment syndicate funds?
Depends on how it's structured, probably. And yes. Yeah. I mean, it depends on, it's kind of not enough context for me to necessarily know specifically, but our system's pretty customizable, so I'm happy to talk offline of like if it could specifically work for your situation.
Perfect. And then does frequent change in service provider create a bad image from current and future investor perspectives?
That's a great question. You know, I don't think you want to be changing service providers all the time. One, because it's like just chaos for you, and a lot of noise to have to, it's not easy to change providers. You know, but I think if you can explain why you're doing it, I think a change isn't a big deal at all. It's just like, hey, you know, we're really looking for this, or we feel like this is an upgrade for these reasons, or, you know, whatever it may be. I think if, you know, or if there's been mistakes made, then making a change makes sense, right? It shows that you're, you know, alert and paying attention and care a lot about that function. You know, audit and tax, I think as long as it's an improvement in the firm that you're using, or there's a reason for going regional from Big Four, right? So at the end of a life of a fund or something, where most of the investments have been liquidated, maybe everyone feels comfortable saving money and going to a regional firm at that point or something like that. I think it really depends. It's pretty situational. I wouldn't want to do it all the time, but again, like I think making changes when certain things have happened, again, show that you're alert and that you're caring about that function and that it's important. The quality is important to you.
Got it. And then does Aduro use a budgeting software for the management company, or is that primarily being done in Excel?
So we don't use a budgeting software because primarily we're supporting our GPs who are developing their budgets. And so we do have internal sort of like one experience in sort of helping support GPs as they create their budgets and having conversations about what's important to them. But for us, we don't like create budgets and things like that because I don't know what your strategy is and I can't tell you, you know what, you have say $1 million in management fee a year, you should spend 100,000 on an office space and you should spend 50,000 on marketing, right? Because maybe you're actually trying to be super under the radar, you don't want a lot of press, so you should spend no money on marketing. You're like, that's not in line with my strategy. And you think offices are so, you know, 2019. And then the future, even beyond the pandemic, you're going to have no office and be all over the country and have a dispersed team, right? Like those are all things that are specific to our GPs and what they think their sort of strategy and secret sauce is. So we can have conversations to say, like, this is how much money you have. This is how much your tax expense is. This is how much your, you know, audit or whatever is going to cost or a Duro cost. But it's really hard to help determine sort of the discretionary pieces without a lot of support from the GP, which is why we kind of ask them to take the lead on a lot of that.
Got it. And then the last question that has come in, does fund admin typically work on side of SPV vehicles? And then says we typically build for some of our LPs and some larger stage companies.
I'm not sure I understand the question fully. We do support SPVs and larger SPVs and have fees specific to those SPVs. But I'm not sure about the second piece may be specific to that circumstance or that legal agreement. So I'm not sure that I have enough color to give more insight on that one, but happy to talk offline on that as well.
Great. Okay, those are it for the questions that have come in, and I know you may have one or two more on your end.
I think those are the like highlights that hopefully, you know, we didn't get to cover kind of in the rest of the content. There were some technical questions that are a little bit more complex to talk about in sort of this format. And so I'm happy to share my contact information after this and talk offline to anyone who has questions about, you know, there are a couple management fee questions about offsets and kind of what's going on there and some tax questions. I'm always happy to talk about that offline, but here's probably a little tricky without fund specifics and stuff. So,
Perfect.
I'll share my contact information with everyone and we can kind of go from there. But it's been so wonderful to get to connect with everyone and I hope you found this useful. Yeah. So.
Yes, Jess, thank you again for the wealth of knowledge you brought. I think it was really, really great. And it's been in the chat, it's been really great to see questions and conversations and just a lot of appreciation for your words and your knowledge. So thank you again for everything. We will follow up with an email from Jess with her information to contact her. I don't know if there's something you want me to drop in the chat right now to contact you for next
Yeah.
steps as well while people are still on.
I mean, you can just email me if you have questions. It's just Jess, Jess, at aduroadvisors.com. So happy to chat with anyone. If you have any questions about it. I know that this can be a really daunting topic, and I think I'm always happy to make sure that this community is set up for success, so that we see a lot of exciting new founders in the next 6 months, year, 18 months, whenever. So
Perfect. Well, thank you again, Jess. We
thanks,
appreciate your
everyone.
time. Again, we will have a survey go out right after this in the next 10 minutes. So please give us your feedback, and we will have a recording of this session for you all to kind of reference throughout your building of funds. So thank you again, and we will be in touch. Thank you, Jess.
Thanks, guys.
Looking
Thanks,
forward to
Emmy.
working
Thanks,
with you
Marion.
in the future.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Bye. Have a good
Bye.
one.